Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Trust you had a great weekend. It remains cold here in Nairobi, and I saw a tweet from Zero Hedge who says it's all about the lack of sunbursts on the sun. Let's start with some macro thoughts. This is a comparison of crypto versus fiat currency returns, and it's from Charlie Bilello, and it kind of sums it up. Crashing currency chaos spreads across the global south, Asia Times, Pepe Escobar. The Iranian rial crash, the Turkish lira crash, the Argentine peso crash, the Brazilian real crash. There are multiple complex parallel vectors at play in the wilderness of crashing currencies. No more liquid dollars flooding emerging markets such as Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, or India. US interest rates are up. The Fed stopped buying new bonds. The US Treasury is issuing new bond debt. Thus, QT, combined with a global targeted trade war against major emerging markets, spells out the new normal, the weaponization of the dollar. According to Pepe, that is about to change. Russia and China are heavily invested in buying gold. Russia has dumped US treasuries en masse. And what the BRICS had been discussing since the mid-2000s is now in motion. The drive to build alternative payment systems to the US dollar, subordinated SWIFT. And saying when and if that happens, arguably at some point in the next decade, US foreign policy configured as an avalanche of sanctions may be effectively neutralized. 20th of August, I wrote a piece, Currency Puzzles and a Weaponized Dollar. And I said in that article, ever since I was a little boy in shorts in Mombasa, reading the back pages of The Economist, which I was wont to do, strangely enough, folks have been talking about the hegemony of the dollar and how this hegemony was set to be broken into tiny little pieces. Iraq's Saddam Hussein was keen to throw the dollar over and ended up dead. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi spoke of a dinar and ended up dead as well. The crypto evangelists have been knocking with an evangelical fervor that reminds me of folks who've been out all night, somewhere like the Ministry of Sound, tired and strung out a little like Elon is behaving of late. If you are betting on the collapse of the dollar, please note it might take an eternity to pan out, and this year it will have proven extremely expensive. 13th of August, I said Trump seems to be relishing his financial warfare strategy. Kenya is lucky to have the Marine 5. My goodness, the spectacle still in awe. Wonderful little 4-second footage of the whale breaking the water surface. Flowers on the Ngorongoro floor. The Ngorongoro Conservation Area has a secret season that is blooming beautiful. This is from Asilia, Africa. An orphan of ivory poaching, Yatta was hand-raised by our keepers and returned back to the wild in a protected area where she became a mom. I've been reading The Carpet Wars, which is really a fantastic book covering Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, 1990s onwards. And in that, two things. Have a look at this, click on this link. Rumi talking about refugees and the dust of old cities falling on top of us, and Zala's Dying Breath. You've got to read them both. Shackleton Expedition. Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. We are living in a fake world, but we find reality in this fake world. Haruki Murakami. Political reflections. China's ambassador to the US US officials don't have sufficient common sense, and the Trump administration should give up the illusion that China will ever give in to intimidation, he said. And this is what I was saying in July, tariff wars, who blinks first? Theresa May's Chequers deal is a fix that will only lead to Brexit victory for Brussels, Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister's plan to tie Britain to EU standards on goods under a common rule book will mean the UK has gone into battle with the white flag fluttering over our leading tank. The whole thing is about as preordained as a bout between giant haystacks and Big Daddy, and in this case I'm afraid the inevitable outcome is a victory for the EU, with the UK lying flat on the canvas and 12 stars circling symbolically over our semi-conscious head. Boris Johnson. Yemen's Hadi is to go to the US for medical treatment. He is the head of the country's internationally recognized government, who has lived in exile in Riyadh since the Iranian-aligned Houthi group captured the Yemeni capital in 2015. Two Yemeni officials told Reuters that Hadi would stay in the United States until the United Nations General Assembly meeting at the end of September. In November last year, I said that then 30-year-old Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman arrived on the scene and immediately launched an unwinnable war. Yemen remains unwinnable. Euro dollars at 116.05, dollar index 95.10, Japanese yen 110.92, Swiss franc 0.9694, the pound 129.19, the Australian dollar is at a 2016 low 7.7192, India rupee 70.763, so just off a record low, South Korean won 11.1025. The Rial 40544, Egyptian pound 17.8135. That's been very, very stable, and the rand softening up now 14.75. This is a dollar index chart from Adam Mancini. I think the stop stays at 94, the target remains 100. Euro dollar 116.03. We're running out of impetus to the upside. We could just take off to the downside. A very long-term perspective rounding bottom in dollar Canada. Interesting chart from some chartist, and predicting a move up to 146. We're currently at 130.57. The Australian dollar is at the lowest since December 2016, 0.7192. Bitcoin has rallied of late. We're now at 7,245 last. Commodity markets, S&P Goldman Sachs commodity indices performance data as of August 31st, 2018. That's from Chi-Girl. Gives you interesting data points as to how performance has happened over the last week, month, etc. Gold just below 1,200. I'm not bullish. I think we're going to wobble lower. Crude oil 69.56. So having stalled at the $70 a barrel mark. Speculators have raised a record bearish bet in raw sugar. Look at this to get an idea from Hong Kong as to how short the market is. Emerging markets has been an ugly August for emerging markets. This is a monthly chart of the Brazilian real from Pinecone Macro. We continue to soften. After US Trump sanctions in August, Turkey's exports dropped 6.5% compared to the same month in 2017. I wrote a piece in August, Cold Turkey, have a read, and the Turkish lira started lower this week ahead of crucial CPI data. My piece over the weekend is called Africa, the Bell at the Ball. I remember a time when my 11-year-old daughter Layla had attended the school disco, and when I picked her up, her eyes glittered and she could scarcely stand still, and I asked, "Darling, how was it?" And she said to me, "Daddy, I danced and I danced and I didn't stop." I wanted to pick her up and spin her because, as Jean Rhys wrote in her novel Wide Sargasso Sea, Only the magic and the dream are true, all the rest's a lie. And I must remember about chandeliers and dancing, about swans and roses and snow. The reason my mind looped back to my 11-year-old Layla was because the Financial Times' David Billing had asked me about Theresa May's visit to Africa. I had described the mood music around the trip as quite sweet, and according to David, I was one of the few commentators to praise the Prime Minister's dancing in Cape Town. I thought Theresa May deserved a big up and also said, because of its history, Britain has a lot of leverage and indeed ground-level knowledge of the continent. So in a post-Brexit world, it makes sense to sweat its African equity. I also said Britain preceded China in the US and is seeking to play to that advantage. This is largely a born-free generation, and the UK is wise to play to that theme for multiple overlapping reasons. The reason dancing and giddiness came to mind was because Africa has been a little swept off its feet over the last few days. Since June, Narendra Modi, India's Prime Minister, Recep Erdogan, President of Turkey, Xi Jinping, President of China, have all made African forays. Emmanuel Macron, President of France, has visited the continent 3 times since November. President Kenyatta was received by President Trump. Prime Minister Theresa May dialed up Africa last week, as did Angela Merkel. And now just about everyone has trooped off to China to make win-win music with Xi Jinping and his FOCAC gig. John Ashbourne said African politicians should be praying for a Sino-Western bidding war for their affections, a huge opportunity if they can play it well. Howard French responded no, they should go one step further and devise well-thought-out development strategies based on a deep reading of national interest, generating as much local financing as possible and pushing hard on regional integration. So we might well ask, what is going on? Let me give you some hardcore data. The 50 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have a combined output of $1.4 trillion, less than half the size of France's economy. According to the IMF estimates for 2018, from 2000 to 2016, China loaned around $125 billion to the continent, data from the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins. Chinese goods exports to Africa are 8 times larger than those of the UK and even bigger than the top 3 exporters, Germany, France and the US combined. A wave of African nations are looking to restructure debt with China on the eve of the FOCAC summit in Beijing, and this provides a reality check. Ethiopia and Zambia, heavy borrowers from China, have expressed desire to restructure that debt, while bankers believe Angola and Congo Republic have already done so, though details of such deals are sparse. The IMF says Cameroon, Ghana and others face a high risk of debt distress, as does Djibouti, whose main source of foreign loans is China, the fund says, and which holds the majority of external debt. China had a singular and positive influence on Africa. It rebalanced the demand side for Africa's commodities and also bought those commodities on a long-term basis. It was this which triggered the African recovery some 2 decades ago. However, since then, a freewheeling China Inc. has favoured elites, has facilitated large-scale looting via inflated infrastructure, some of which were white elephants on day one, and has lumped the African citizen with the tap. How this plays out now is the key to Sino-African relations going forward. A Hambantota scenario would be problematic. That was with reference to the Sri Lankan port, which has been leased to China for 99 years. The West is pushing back for a number of reasons, certainly since uncorking Libya, immigration in Europe is a big theme. There is a clearer sense that in order to stem immigration, Europe needs to put its shoulder to the wheel and look at how to stimulate African economies and job creation. President Trump is also rattling Xi Jinping's golden cage and surely wants to bottle up China in the South China Sea, and hence the Indian Ocean becomes central. It even got a mention in Trump and Uhuru's press release. However, most of all, the West sees a very big debt crisis looming and is positioning for the fallout. The dominoes have already started to fall. Now we will really find out if Xi Jinping is Santa Claus. Theresa May started her trip in Cape Town, which was particularly apt given that on February 3rd, 1960, another British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, said, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact," he said. I refer you to Uganda. Bobby and Barbie Wine have now arrived in the US, but what caught my attention was a video of revelers at a Tarrus Riley concert while chanting "People Power" through bottles of Baby Cool Eugene. Wiley was on stage performing and later ended his performance. Inflection points are difficult to discern, but this is one right here. A debt crisis and a political inflection point where those who fought for independence hand over to the born-free generation is in fact a double whammy. Beijing FOCAC under the theme of China and Africa toward an even stronger community with a shared future through win-win cooperation. We believe that with the joint efforts of China and Africa, the Beijing summit will be a great success and establish a new historical monument of China-Africa friendly cooperation. Africa is seeking China deals that will bring jobs and skills, says the Financial Times. Quest for more manufacturing investment from China next week as they converge on Beijing for a summit. Chinese investment in Africa has grown, reaching $2.4 billion in 2016, dwarfed by a trade relationship worth $170 billion last year. China became Africa's largest trading partner in 2009. Chinese manufactured goods make up more than 80% of China's exports to Africa. But as demand for commodities slowed, Africa's trade deficit with China widened. In 2016, it was equivalent to Africa's trade deficit with the rest of the world. John Ashbourne said African politicians should be praying for a Sino-Western bidding war for their affections. A huge opportunity if they can play it well, he said. Howard French said no, they should go one step further and devise well-thought-out development strategies based on a deep reading of national interest, generating as much local financing as possible, and pushing hard on regional integration. Look at this photograph while the Chinese are taking notes. Not one person on the Zambian delegation has pen and paper. Atitia says it's a case of the blind leading the clueless. What would it take to convince these leaders that Africa's salvation lies in Africa, not inside the inner sanctum of the Chinese Politburo? Trains delayed, Ethiopia debt woes curtail China funding. This is interesting, so China is already turning the screw. Horn of Africa nation, 100 million people faces debt distress. There are signs of China, major creditors, slowing financing to Ethiopia's doubts grow over the profitability of some infrastructure projects there. Safely arrived in the US while they're receiving specialized treatment following the brutal torture at the hands of SFC soldiers. That's Bobby Wine. The video I was referring to in my article, revelers at a Taurus riding concert, people power, basically threw bottles of baby Jew to support the president. That's an inflection point. If Shadari wins, the pundits are saying Kabila will rule from the shadows as if he had never succumbed to massive regional and Western pressure to leave power, and called elections for December. The Intercept's Nick Terse has a fascinating article. This is a kamikaze mission. Gunshots ring out as the troops advance down a dirt road, one of them in full combat gear, helmet camouflage, uniform, automatic weapon, clowns for the camera, and sticks out his tongue. A sergeant next to him says in French, "This is a kamikaze mission." it quickly becomes clear exactly what type of mission this actually is. It's the same type that soldiers carried out at El Mozote in El Salvador in 1981, at My Lai in South Vietnam in 1968, and at Oradour-sur-Glane, France in 1944. It is a massacre. There are some who are not dead, says one of the soldiers when the shooting subsides. The dudes still move. They move, says another. The shocking video shows armed men lining people up face down or sitting against a wall and shooting them with automatic weapons. A second round of shooting ensures no survivors. Here is yet more credible evidence to support the allegations that Cameroon's armed forces have committed grave crimes against civilians. It's quite awful. South African oil shares down 1.41% this year. Dollar versus Rand, 14.7594. I'm bearish about the Rand. Egyptian pound, about which I'm bullish, that's really behaved extraordinarily well. President Buhari arrives in Beijing for the FOCAC summit. MTN may get Naira refund by paying $8.1 billion, Nigeria demands. Nigerian oil shares down 8.88% this year. Ghana Stock Exchange is up 7.86% this year. India may tighten rules for FPIS coming from Mauritius. KRA announced that 16% VAT increase on petroleum products is coming into effect starting on Saturday. These are the new reviewed pump prices, which will be enforced from 1st to the 14th of September. ARM Cement reported first half earnings per share was negative 4 shillings and 85 cents. Revenue was down 56% at 2.35 billion. A loss before tax 2.5 billion. Loss after tax 2.32 billion. Total equity 19 billion. And these are three components I will draw your attention to. This is the balance sheet and the P&L. This is a statement about the situation they found themselves in, and finally a response to this report that they did not declare all the debts. Home Africa reported first half earnings per share was negative 9.091%. They reported a loss for the period of 111.63 million. During the month of August, the yields on the 10 and 30-year Eurobond rose by 0.8 and 0.7 to 7.9% and 8.8%. On a year-to-date basis, the shilling has gained by 2.5% against the dollar, largely on the back of improving diaspora remittances, which increased by 4.9% to $266.2 million in June 2018. NSC was on a downward trend. The all share declined 1.7%, NSC 20 2.8%, and NSC 25 3.2%. Market currently trades at a price to earnings ratio of 13.9 times. Nairobi all shares down 2.11%, NSC 20 is down 13.7%. Thank you for stopping by.